Leading up to the First World War, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or SPD, was one of the largest political parties in Germany and the world, with over 1 million active members. When the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and the various treaties between the great powers of Europe came into effect, it came time for the Reichstag to vote on whether it would grant the government the war credits necessary to wage war. The SPD, the so-called anti-imperialist Revolutionary Socialist Party, voted in favor of granting the German government its war credits, enabling them to go to war in what would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. This video covers the history of the party prior to the onset of World War I, the decision to vote in favor of war, and the aftermath this decision had on the party. The SPD were founded in 1875 when the General German Workers' Association, led by Ferdinand Lassalle, and the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, founded by August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, merged together in a conference at Gotha. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had outlawed the party under his anti-socialist laws in 1878, but the party became increasingly radical, growing dramatically in spite of the repression, and both Marx and Engels had an increasing influence over the party's ideology and platform. When the laws lapsed in 1890, the party continued to grow its electoral base and openly advocated for the continuation of the class struggle. Socialist philosophy regarding the question of national defense and war and its relation to the socialist revolution evolved over the decades leading up to 1914. From 1848 to 1850, Marx and Engels viewed war as a potential catalyst for revolution, being influenced by the French Revolution in the late 1700s. Influenced by Tsarist Russian armies being sent to Central Europe to suppress revolution in 1848, Marx believed that Russia was a bastion of reaction in Europe and that a war against Tsarism would revolutionize Western Europe. This thinking laid the foundations for German socialist tradition of Russophobia. Their attitudes changed in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, which pitted the most promising workers' movements in Europe against one another, and both began to favor peace. When the war began, the French socialists decried it as a war of imperialist aggression, while the majority of German socialists considered it one of national defense. Socialists in parliament like the Lassallians voted for war credits, while others abstained or opposed. Marx initially considered it a war of national defense, but when the French were defeated at Sedan and the new republic proclaimed, denounced it as a clear act of aggression when the Prussians annexed Alsace-Lorraine and asked German socialists to demonstrate against it. Marx's writings during this time began to lay a theoretical Marxist foundation in favor of war, so long as it was one of national defense, and the looming spectre of Tsarist Russia continued to haunt German Socialist Party congresses over the following decades. Congresses from 1891 to 1904 deliberated on the effectiveness of a general strike as a means to prevent war, but were rejected as being too anarchistic. However, the 1905 revolution in Russia made Europe's socialists reconsider its effectiveness. In 1907, socialists met again in the Stuttgart Congress to debate their position in the event of a global war, which seemed an ever-increasing possibility. By the end, the resolution reached was meaningless, with French socialists being glad it didn't prohibit revolutionary measures such as a general strike as a method to avert war, while the German socialists were glad the resolution didn't prescribe any revolutionary measures to prevent war. It contained something for everybody whilst committing no one to anything. The lack of unity between the two largest socialist movements in Europe meant that there could be no effective proletarian action to avert a war. The party's failure in the 1907 elections, in which they were denounced as unpatriotic and even treasonous, convinced many of the party members to adopt a more nationalistic approach, abandoning the commitment to class struggle. Although a sizable force in society and the Reichstag with 35% of the vote in the 1912 elections, they were still prevented from assuming power and were ostracized both politically and socially. They had begun to move away from revolutionary socialism and rejected French socialist calls for revolutionary action to prevent war, fearing repercussions from the government. The party leadership began to cozy up to the Reich and German establishment as a matter of self-preservation. The SPD by 1914 was a coalition of various leftists, from non-Marxist social democrats like Philipp Scheidemann to centrist Marxists like Karl Kautsky to radical revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. In November 1912, the Congress of International Socialists in Basel, of which the SPD was a leading figure, agreed that, quote, workers of all countries to oppose capitalist imperialism with the power of the international solidarity of the working classes. The conference also threatened the ruling classes of the various capitalist nations with revolution in the event of a war. This, however, seemingly only represented the revolutionary wing of the party, and the leadership became increasingly dominated by anti-revolutionary pragmatists, including figures like August Bebel and Friedrich Ebert, who embraced a blend of bourgeois and proletarian patriotism and called for the German working class and SPD voters to defend the fatherland in the event of a defensive war. The fear of being seen as unpatriotic continued to dominate the SPD's actions leading up to the outbreak of war. The ideological foundations for the SPD's decision to go to war in July 1914 began in the years prior. Many party leaders had abandoned the previous commitment to class struggle and, as previously mentioned, embraced a sort of left-wing patriotism in an effort to gain more acceptance among the bourgeois elements of German society. Similar sentiments were shared by large numbers of the SPD's working-class voter base as well. Head of the Bavarian Social Democrats Georg Vollmar informed his Diet in October 1912 that, quote, if Germany became involved in a war not of her own making, the fatherland's needs would take precedence over all other considerations, and Social Democrats would prove themselves to be not the least of its defenders. At the same time, however, the SPD leadership organized anti-war demonstrations in the wake of the Agadir crisis in 1911 and the Italo-Turkish War of 1911-12, and told the Reichstag that, quote, Germany must not join any alliance which obliges her to shed the blood of a single worker in order to satisfy the ambitions, rapacity, and thirst for conquest of certain cliques. Though it may seem like it, these two positions were not contradictory. The SPD were unwilling to support a war of German aggression, which would be in the interest of the bourgeois, industrialists, and imperialists, but was willing to come to the fatherland's aid if Germany were attacked by a foreign power. Edouard David, another leading party figure, also included the provision that, quote, if one nation bent on precipitating war were to confront its opponent with such insolent and annihilating demands, it would allow him no alternative but to fight back. Leading up to the start of World War I, although the SPD and its working-class voter base continued to stage demonstrations against war and for peace, these sentiments began to dissipate after the Italo-Turkish War. From 1913 onwards, the SPD believed that peace would be maintained in Europe, believing in Karl Kautsky's theory of ultra-imperialism. Kautsky believed that capitalist nations would not go to war as war would lead to economic stagnation, hurting their profits, and that cooperation similar to that of a banking cartel between nations was economically preferable and thus would prevent war. This was a rejection of Marxist theory and brought derision from the left wing of the SPD, but became the dominant ideology amongst German and French socialists. All the way up to July 1914, the SPD leadership believed that industry and its government did not want war. It became clear, however, to the nations of Europe that a major war was imminent, and Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, hitherto against granting power to the SPD, understood the pragmatic benefit of not ostracizing them for the sake of having a united nation in the event of a war. With attacks from the right denouncing the SPD and its voters as unpatriotic, several SPD speakers in Parliament continue to affirm that the SPD's patriotic fervour surpassed the traditional upholders of order. Many in the party were nervous regarding potential Russian aggression, and Russophobia was present amongst much of the SPD leadership and German working class. They believed that if Russia were to take over Germany in a war, and the SPD had failed to resist, the Russians would create an autocratic state in Germany, and any reforms or advancements made for the German working class would be destroyed. When the Archduke was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip in late June, the SPD immediately convened a meeting, discussing the impact the murder would have on the Vienna Congress scheduled for August 23rd, failing to imagine the possible national repercussions of the assassination. As the SPD pondered on what to do, the Hollweg government resisted attempts to suppress it, believing the reintroduction of anti-socialist laws to be illegal and that government action against the SPD at this crucial time would unite the party's various factions against the government, and antagonizing them in any way would work to sabotage the war effort. The government looked fondly on the internal party fractions as it did the various declarations in favour of a defensive war, but those same divisions made it difficult for the government to predict how the party would act in the event of war. This went as far as allowing the SPD to stage anti-war demonstrations as late as the 28th of July. During the Brussels meeting from the 28th to the 29th of July, SPD party chairman Hugo Haas affirmed that, quote, Austria seems to count on Germany, but the German socialists declared that secret treaties do not commit the proletariat to anything. The German proletariat says that Germany must not intervene even if Russia does. This, however, contradicts previous statements that the SPD would come to Germany's aid in the event of war. On July 31st, the German government offered an ultimatum to the Russians to demobilize within 12 hours but received no reply, declaring war on August 1st. By August 3rd, the government was confident in the SPD's position and declared war on both Belgium and France. That same day, the SPD voted 96 to 14 to go to war and unanimously to grant war credits, with even radicals like Karl Liebknecht opting to abstain rather than vote no for the sake of party unity. The SPD had, by this point, completely abandoned their socialist principles in favour of defending the fatherland and became complicit in authorising the slaughter that followed. By August 4th, all the great powers of Europe were at war, including Germany. The initial victories the German army had won in the first few weeks reassured many that the war would be short and result in a German victory. The SPD reassured themselves of their support by insisting that this war was one of national defence rather than aggression, but German expansion into Luxembourg and their violation of Belgian neutrality clearly demonstrates it was a war of aggression. Prior to the war, they had convinced themselves, in accordance with ultra-imperialist theory, that the German government had always been acting in the interest of peace. Thus, Germany's participation in the war meant that Germany was being attacked, and thus the SPD could rally to the nation's defence. The Bergfriedenspolitik, or party truce of August 4th, meant that even the radical left of the party abstained from voting against the war credits, believing that party unity was more important. Even if the SPD voted unanimously against the war and war credits, that would not have changed the outcome as they did not hold a majority in the Reichstag, but voted in favour partly to prevent government repression and further social and political ostracization. The majority of the SPD were motivated by and felt that, as oppressed and beleaguered as they were in Germany, the potential of a Russian victory and Tsarist autocracy extending into Germany, which would destroy any of the progress made in favour of German workers, was too bad an outcome, and now required them to unite behind the nation. They also hoped that their unanimous support for the war would lead to political reforms afterwards, such as the abolition of the three-class voting system. Likewise, the French Socialists voted for war credits in support of national defence, although unlike the German Socialists, they had a more credible argument. French Socialists would follow the Republican tradition by defending against the reactionary forces of Germany, and German Socialists would defend against the reactionary Tsarist forces of Russia. The vote led to an internal party split, and most unions toed the government line for the sake of unity, with the Free Association of German Trade Unions refusing the Bergfrieden. On August 4th, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, and others formed the Spartacus League, a revolutionary Marxist organization in response to the SPD's betrayal of international socialism, and would become the foundation for the KPD post-war. In the Junior's pamphlet published in 1915, Luxemburg used Marxist arguments to denounce the war as one of capitalist and imperialist aggression, but others in the SPD who supported the war used Marxist arguments to justify their positions, citing Marx's writings on the Franco-Prussian War and Engels's writings in 1891 to August Babel, where he says, quote, that if war is forced upon us, and moreover a war in alliance with Russia, we must regard this as an attack on our existence and defend ourselves by every method, utilizing all positions at our disposal. Liebknecht was the first SPD member to vote against new war loans on December 2, 1914, and more party members began to follow suit, such as Otto Röhler in 1915, and opposition to the war within the party began to grow over time. In 1916 and 17, SPD members such as Liebknecht were either arrested or expelled from the party for protesting the war, and many of those who were expelled or left voluntarily, such as former chairman Haas, went on to form the USPD, or Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. Although by the end of the war the party remained more divided and fractured than ever, it still emerged as the most popular political party post-war, and its leadership would be instrumental in forming Germany's first democracy. The SPD was founded as a revolutionary party in 1875, and in spite of Bismarckian repression, continued to grow into a formidable political force over time. The party was a broad coalition of left-wing members ranging from revolutionary Marxists to liberals. As 1914 approached, the party began to abandon the class struggle previously advocated for, and the leadership began to cozy up to the government and emperor. The party was being denounced by the right as unpatriotic and treasonous, and that encouraged the leadership to exhibit and advocate for a left-wing patriotism and for the SPD to come to the aid of the government in the name of national defence. They pursued a policy of caution, being influenced by the anti-socialist laws, and did not want to jeopardize their achievements with any revolutionary anti-war action that would bring about the party's destruction. The threat of a militant anti-war action disappeared, and with it any unified socialist response to the war. When war approached, the SPD unanimously voted for war, with the left-wing anti-militarist faction opting to abstain from voting rather than vote no for the sake of party unity. Even in the event that the SPD unanimously voted against the war, their lack of a Reichstag majority would not have prevented prevented granting war credits to the government. The party was still complicit in sending hundreds of thousands of German workers to their deaths in the fields of Europe. The stance of the party leadership led to internal fractures, with the anti-war wing officially being expelled from the party from 1917 onwards, and the radicals forming the Spartacus League. Even so, the SPD emerged from World War I as the most popular party in Germany, and was instrumental in forming Germany's first democratic republic in 1918. At the end of the day, the party's stance to support the war in August 1914 was a blatant betrayal of the core socialist values of anti-capitalism, anti-militarism, and anti-imperialism they claimed to uphold. Thanks for watching.